The 2025 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by Union Theological Seminary in the City of New York, the Episcopal Diocese of California, King's College London, Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, the Center for Black Theology at Regent's Park College, Oxford, the Protestant Theological Institute of Paris, and in partnership with the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
Thank you, brother.
Over to you.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this occasion. All of you are here with. This has been wonderful, and to hear how things have been framed so far. In many ways, it allows me to play the music in the way I want to play my theological music. So I just want to say a few things, a very brief schematic, which is really not in this paper, and I'll explain that in a second. But when I think about my friend Dwight Hopkins, who laid out this wonderful history, and he's great at that. You know, one of the things I always describe Dwight as that person who finds, after Cone, finds the shoes that fit our feet. That's the name of one of his books. So because he picks up on that history in this really wonderful way. And Dwight was responsible for a group called the Black Theology Forum. And that Black Theology Forum included Dwight. It also included James Noel, who was a student of Charles Long, who was my teacher. It included George Cummings. And George Cummings went in the direction of dialogue of Black theology with Latin American liberation theology. Then it included Will Coleman. And Will Coleman went looking at more African traditions, critiquing Cone from that vantage point, also building on Cone's work. And then you had the Romanist tradition. So I lay out that brief schematic to sort of give you some insight into how I show up. Because I often call myself the last, because that group was defunct. I think they brought it back now. But I always call myself the last defunct member of the Black Theology Forum. And my goal was to go back behind Cone to see how Cone had appropriated Bart and all of that, because there was only one other dissertation even on the topic. So that's how I kind of show up. And so I offer that to say that because I want you to know that this paper is not a historical recounting. I can't do that better than Dwight. This paper shows up, not, if I may use the German a little bit here, not as history. It shows up more like Geschichte, okay? More like this idea of a history that's not grounded, a history beyond facts in a sense, but a kind of eventful participation with God in you in creation or in thinking about theology. I'll say this in a different way and get into this paper. Randy Weston a wonderful pianist, wanted to study with Thelonious Monk. And so Monk invited him to his house. Monk didn't say a word, opened the door, Randy walked in, sat down for hours, and Monk just played. And he said, that's good, that's a good first lesson. And then Randy left, right? And so there's what am I saying? There's a sense in which I just want to play. I want you to hear what I have to say today, and then we'll let that flesh out some of the questions I think I heard this morning, okay? And I want to begin with two quotes. The first quote is from Leonard Cohen, the Canadian singer, and the second quote is from Thelonious Monk. First quote: ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offerings. There's a crack in everything.
That's great time.
That's how the right fits it. The second quote is from Monk, and it reads like this. You know, anybody can play a composition and use 4-hour chords and make it sound wrong. It's making it sound right. That's not easy. Okay? In this second quote, we find Monk, the composer, offering a key insight into how he created songs, meaning with integrity. That is, a song sounds right, and that's not easy. To demonstrate Monk's perception as a composer, I will outline 3 major points as a way to come to terms with the gospel according to Thelonious Monk. That's the title, Hearing the Light, the Gospel According to Thelonious Monk. First, Monk developed his soundscape of his music with respect to a kind of dialogical tension. I didn't say dialectical. In this tension, he privileged the sound or the coherence of a tune. So much so that his way of privileging it opened the door to embracing tensions, ambiguities, nuances, fragments. This allowed Monk to play freely between tones and microtones. The subsequent 2 points in this paper flow from this first point. That is, Monk played inside of tradition, and Monk played outside of tradition. So in composing, arranging, conducting, and performing, which are all part of a single musical architecture, Monk's melodic imagination becomes an analogy for those who would think in a radical theological direction, particularly in relation to Karl Barth, the grand Swiss theologian, and his dogmatic interpretations of Mozart, and James Cone, the father of Black theology, and his existential participation in the spirituals and the blues. Playing in the dialogical, or harmonious thinking. Thelonious Monk, often called the high priest of bebop, which is a genre of jazz that had its heyday in the mid-1940s. It was a revolutionary movement tied to a peculiar cultural and historical impulses. Cornel West identified bebop as, quote, a revolt against the middle-class jazz of the museums, against swing and white musicians whose styles had become culturally hegemonic. Bebop, in this respect, symbolizes a period where a kind of coming of age for Black jazz artists and Black people in general resonated with a cultural shift and mood. It was part of the zeitgeist. And Monk's predilection for playing bebop jazz revolved around playing and dancing within contrast, tensions, and juxtapositions. It's no secret that Monk was, quote, interested in how things struggle with their opposites, close quote. And this playing within the dialogical tensions is not limited to the way Monk played his music. For instance, using flat fingers rather than playing with his fingers like a cat. You know how we supposed to play like this? In fact, Monk played the piano like a percussion instrument, which it is. Okay. But Monk also, when you think of him, his playing wasn't just in the way he played. What was important for Monk was this, first of all, this mode of thinking about music, an approach I've come to call a form of hermeneutical musicality, or harmonious thinking. And you hear this thinking, first of all, in the aphorisms, characterized by witty 3-word phrases like, 2 is 1, or discrimination is important. Now, regarding this latter statement, he suggests that what you leave out of a tune is just as important as what you put into it. So the key to a good melody is not just what you add, it may be what you subtract. Think about that in theological terms. Other phrases of Monk include, play the melody, or hear the light, 2 of my favorites. Monk's approach to tensions and contrasts and contingencies can be heard in how he listened for music, which shapes what it means to do theology in the mode of Monk. Yusef Komunyaka, a poet, described well Monk's way of listening in its relationship to his melodic imagination. He said this: Monk's music requires an active listener, someone who does not have to be told the whole story. For there's an emotional elasticity in Monk's world. Things that seem at odds with each other fit side by side. The human mind does the framing, inside and outside of conventional references. In this respect, I agree with those who argue that Monk's, quote, conception of music is hearing between the lines of its own accord, and that nonconformist ego told him that what he heard was perfectly valid. This courage to play your own way is one of the things I admire most about Monk. Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Mary Lou Williams, and so many other jazz luminaries. They played their music their way. They were not, in the words of Toni Morrison, preoccupied with the white gaze. This reminds me of an interview by Cornel West, who described another bebopper named Charlie Bird Parker. The title of the interview is illuminating. It is, Charlie Parker didn't give a damn. Okay? And the point is that Parker was more concerned about being active in his own playing rather than being reactive to whiteness. Thus, this form of radical subjectivity situates Monk on the subjective side of Karl Barth's objective interpretations of Mozart's music, and on the objective side of James Cone's subjective participation in the spirituals and the blues. In other words, it places him on the inside, meaning in between the cracks, those places where the light gets in, dancing around the objective and the subjective. Listen to Karl Barth's description of his objective view of Mozart. He reads like this. Mozart's music is not a personal confession. He does not reveal in his music any doctrine, and certainly not himself. Mozart does not wish to say anything. He just sings and sounds. Thus, he does not force anything on the listener, does not demand that the listener make any decisions or take any positions. He simply leaves the listener free. And then he goes on, he's just waxing eloquent about Mozart. He says, Mozart apprehended the cosmos and now, functioning only as a medium, brings it into song. Truly, we can call this incomparable. That's Barth's interpretation of Mozart, and it reflects Barth's theology. By contrast, James Howell Cone, the father of Black theology, stands on the other side of Barth. He emphasizes the existential and subjective insights when describing, for example, the spirituals and the blues, a book representing his most important turn in Black theology. Cone said the following: existentially, the subject matter and focus of this book have been defined by the Black musical forms which have influenced my life. I've written about the spirituals and the blues because I've lived the experience which created them. I affirm the reality of the spirituals and blues as authentic expressions of my humanity, responding to them in rhythms of dance. I therefore write about the spirituals and the blues because I am the blues, and my life is a spiritual. Without them, I cannot be. In this, we hear this juxtaposition, without it being a strict contradiction, that is between Barth's dogmatic interpretation on one hand, Cone's existential participation on the other. They're speaking in terms of an emphasis or an accent. So don't dogmatize the subjective and the objective, okay? Don't dogmatize it. Don't make it into a binary. Monk, however, approaches this from another perspective. He troubles their categories. How? Because he plays in the surplus and provokes a kind of mindfulness, a playing or framing in a way where things that seem at odds with each other fit side by side. In his melodic logic, Monk inspires a mode of thinking in and around Barth's objective and Cone's subjective orientation. This is why in another context, I argue that Barth turns Schleiermacher upside down, Cone turns Barth inside out, and I move around and round with a hermeneutical circle. Upside down, inside out, and around. Upside down. You know that song? Pensively attending to their differences. Monk inspires, as one writer notes, a disharmonious harmony in his music. This explains why I appreciate Monk's aphorism, his challenging us to hear the light. For we must immediately come to terms with the fact that you're working with a mixed metaphor, for we don't hear light, we see light. In the Western mode of thinking, however, we demand that our ideas be clearer, more rigorous, more precise, because we crave a kind of exactitude. Maybe we're craving control. We moderns have received a heritage where we think, know, and see, not hear, believe, and dance. In the African-American religious aesthetic mode of religious apprehension, I've become fascinated with an oral aesthetics, A-U-R-A-L. In a religious taxonomy that frees or liberates our thinking from categories that tend to overdetermine and circumvent the critical, creative, and constructive power of the Black religious orientations. This kind of religious freedom corresponds with the view of Charles H. Long, the historian of religion, who argued persuasively and provocatively, and he always said this, and he writes in a different way in the book. He said, a theology of freedom is first a critique of theology as a powerful mode of discourse. Catch that. They gotta catch that. This is the first step toward a freedom that liberates. Not merely in our Exodus experiences, but also during our exiles. In case you haven't figured it out yet, Americans are enduring an exile experience right now. And Black Americans have been experiencing that for a much longer time. Thus, in turning to Monk's oral aesthetics, we find a witness to a form of rhythmic tension and repose, musicality and technique, tradition and innovation, structure and spontaneity, point and counterpoint, sounds and silences. They all play a role not merely in Monk's musical improvising, but hopefully in our theologizing. And with a little bit of phenomenological imagination, if Monk's music can function as a medium, his hermeneutical musicality can be a gift to our theological thinking, both inside and outside the traditions we inhabit. I turn down to Monk's playing on the inside tradition. When thinking of Monk on the inside, we learn that he does not only require active listeners. Monk makes a second demand on his hearers. He surprisingly compels listeners to familiarize themselves with tradition. For he played the past with his left hand and innovated with his right. But the truth is that his appreciation for tradition is implied in his whole compositional approach. Thelonious is third in a line of three great composers that include Jelly Roll Morton, Duke Ellington, who has an aside, I have to say this, I know we're pressed for time, but who has an aside met Queen Elizabeth in Leeds, he was quite fascinated with the meeting, and I think she was too. So he composed a record in her name called the Queen's Suite in her honor. And this record was not pressed for sale until Ellington's death. Now the point is that the record was for her listening pleasure only. Okay? Duke was a true Duke. Noble, elegant, and classy. I just had to tell you that story. But I digress. Monk, nevertheless, as a composer, follows in this musical tradition. Martin Williams, a jazz critic, insightfully portrays jazz history as reflecting a kind of, quote, gradual evolution in rhythm, swinging like a pendulum from innovation to form, the innovation to form. And Monk's innovative approach, however, innovation is found in form, and Monk carries, extends, and signifies on previous forms, and then, through tradition itself, creatively addresses thematic developments associated with Black cultural forms. Monk on occasion will split up a theme, alter the chords, and commit only, in his quote, the best aspects of the original, rid of its prettiness and its sentimentality, and leave it only with its implicit beauty, as he sees it. So on one hand, he's composing in tradition, and on the other hand, he's innovating and recomposing in relationship to it, dancing a little to the side without being outside. Dialogical tension on the inside. Here I agree with Stanley Crouch, the poet and cultural critic, who argued that Monk's music was so far inside the tradition that he seemed to demand that the listener have a thorough enough knowledge of it, of the African-American legacy, to appreciate how he was playing around with it, off it, and through it, signifying it. That's what I was doing when I came doing that conference that you had. And my title of my paper was called Signifying Monk. We'll talk about that later. Theologically, Carr White interpreted other theologians in a similar mode of discovery, using a method he described as interpretatio in bonum partum, or millerum or optimum partum, which means interpretation in a good, better, or best way, extracting the best and therefore the most useful parts. In this way of reading his predecessors and his contemporaries, he made a fiduciary commitment to the past, gaining insights even from their oversights. Perhaps Alexander McElway is correct when he describes Barton's approach as a teacher and what I hear in distinctive Monkian overtones. Reads like this. When Barton interpreted a theologian in terms of the best parts of her or his work, he was affirming the fact that no system of thought is so enclosed by error that it cannot also speak a meaningful word to the church. And I believe he was also asserting that not only his view of Scripture and not only his understanding of the incarnation can yield useful reflections of faith, but that the whole tradition, with its various systems and their parts, is capable of such articulation, if one would but look for it. And I say listen for it. Okay? James Cone takes a similar approach, stating once in the classroom that with all brilliant insight, there's some blindness. And then he said for Cone, you read Cone, especially My Soul Looks Back, he said he was always searching for ingredients to put in my own view of the gospel and the black liberation struggle. He continues, Barth, Tillich, Bultmann, Bonhoeffer, and other Europeans were merely the tools I appropriated in order to say what I believe was the truth of the gospel as defined by the black experience. Close quote. In this I hear Barth and Cone, like Monk, deliberating over each moment, pensively agonizing for the right sound. So this lecture is not designed to explicate Barth in order to clarify what Barth is doing. It's designed to implicate Barth in relation to Cone in order to clarify what I'm doing. This is Monk mode. It is not an apologetic move. It is a proleptic term designed to articulate a tradition on the inside, moving it forward and bringing it up to date, recomposing, signifying. When we bring a Janus-faced monk, even known as being Janus-faced, looking in two directions at once. Think of the god Janus. When we bring a Janus-faced monk to the conversation between Barth and Cone, that is one who plays ambidextrously, looking in two directions, past and future, toward Barth and Cone. We're not creating a movement, but participating in a movement within a movement. That's why Monk was described. Monk was a revolution within a revolution. And I always say when you got a revolution within a revolution, that means you point to something beyond revolutions. Because revolutions devour their children. Sometimes they just promise paradise. Rarely deliverance. Let me continue. When we understand that, then unity and community are found precisely in the affirmation of our differences, and the willingness to dance in the tensions and the juxtapositions of our traditions in an age of uncertainty. Monk's way of attending to tradition and the transition, transmuting and improvising on it while making the best of it has had a fundamental and functional effect on my theologizing. But Monk just doesn't play inside tradition. He plays on the outside tradition. And I'll say some things about that. I may have to skip through a little bit. This is how we're doing with time here. Make sure I'm going to be true to the time, my brother. I'm already at 20 minutes, so I'm going to skip through kind of quickly, all right? That long introduction got me a little bit there, all right? This brings me to perhaps the most demanding and liberating aspect of Monk's musical estate. To understand how Monk could play so pensively on the inside of tradition, which allowed him to innovate so freely and spontaneously and joyfully outside of tradition, we must come to terms with how Monk revived the traditional idea of basing his variations and improvisations directly on the melody. The melody is the keynote to his whole approach to jazz, and it was affirmed in his advice to artists. He said, play the melody. Play the melody. You know, brother, we were talking about earlier, playing the melody in your head. He said, you can make a better solo if you know the tune. Everything, the remaining elements, the sequencing of the song, including the rhythms and the harmonies, and even the spaces and silences were determined by their relationship to the melody. In fact, Monk is often described as playing according to a cantus firmus. Some of you may have heard that before. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer makes that point. He said, where the cantus firmus is clear and plain, the counterpoint can be developed to its limits. Monk plays with a clear cantus firmus. Monk also functions as a medium like Mozart. And I actually give a part of that where I describe how Monk is described in the same way they describe Barth. Right? It's almost like Monk is, because he ties to the melody in a way, he focuses on it in a way where it's almost objective. On the other hand, however, Monk expresses fully his own individuation, manipulating the black keys, sharps and flats. He can highlight the melody by subtracting and distilling it as effectively as others add to it. The wrong notes are his choices. The silences are his. The melodic fragments, the harmonic clusters, and rhythmic displacements are all included in Monk's melodic imagination. He embraces the harmonic and the rhythmic tensions. He ventures off the beat, then on it, back off it. He zigzags, loops around, bends a note here, leaves a note over there, suggesting while all the time anticipating his melodic goal well in advance, sometimes leaving tensions until the very last possible moment, and then leaving them sometimes unresolved altogether. For Monk, the means and the ends cohere. That's a quote from King, by the way. What comes above all else for Monk, at least in performance, is the rhythm, but in relation to the melody, because it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. That's Monk. And this kind of liberated subjectivity You find Monk here closer to James Cone, but still in between the cracks, contributing to the meaning of a divine melody in all its subtle shades. Like the hearing of a soundscape in nature, or viewing the Cherwell River from the bridge of the size of the Magdalen College, or a lovely constellation, Monk was attuned to all the sounds and colors and spaces. Perhaps this is why jazz tradition never became a form of traditionalism for Monk, and why theological tradition should never become traditionalism for the theologians. For the beauty of our past traditions, including the lively ancestral voices, should put us in mind of the brilliant insights of Jaroslav Pelikan, who in his classic treatment of the Christian tradition stated that tradition is the living faith of the dead, but traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. The more I tune to Monk musically, the more the possibilities expand theologically, expanding and becoming more multidimensional and resisting one-dimensionality. For theologians who think through what it means to hear the melody of the divine in the midst of the world, this analogy finds its center in the mystery of Jesus Christ, who in the Assumptio Carnis expresses a radical openness toward the polyphony of voices within the world and encourages us to improvise in relation to the divine melody. In essence, the incarnation takes on a static form in Monk's music, and Monk's music takes on a theological form through the incarnation, while remaining what it is, just jazz. Let me move to a close here. Through what I call a free pneumatic counterpoint, if the cantus firmus is clear and plain, going back to Bonhoeffer, extra church realities in the Word of God heard extramuros ecclesia, that means outside the walls of the church, are set in relief more clearly in folklore, spiritual, blues, and hip-hop, and other modes of being or styles of life which become consequential for the analogical imagination. And this kind of attunement, especially in the African-American aesthetic mode of religious apprehension, relativizes the role of more nationalistic forms of Christianity, or the overdependence on personal piety, religious leaders, and even religious institutions. We become more free to attune and attend to the insight of artists, poets, novelists, and other creators. This preoccupation with Monk constantly begs the question of what would this mean for theology today? What does this mean for those of us hearing the light in the world around us becoming more one-dimensional, more polarized, and the freedoms we share becoming more diminished, darkened by the naturalization of war, the rise of fascism, and the impulses of inspiring dictators in our world? What does the dialogue between Monk's constructive compositional form and creative melodic centering say to our analogical imagination in such troubling times? What is hearing the light in all of its angularities, dissonances, registers, harmonic clusters, and fragments? What can they suggest to us? Can these things represent more than just musical architecture? Can they represent the polyphony of voices speaking in our world? My friend Willie Jennings, who wrote the foreword for my books, and by the way, here's Bart's Mozart. I have up here Cone's Spirituals in the Blue. You should have these books in your library. And then there's Theology in the Mode of Monk. Okay? My friend Willie Jennings asked us something. He said, what does it mean to live through a song or a drum beat? Closing in my life. Live through a song, a drum beat, or a bass guitar riff, or chord progression, or lyrics that capture a stubborn dilemma. And who would find it necessary to do that? The answer to both questions, according to Jennings, is black folks and black life. This, however, is not a racial exclusivity. This is the way of all flesh enfolded in a world of trouble. Then I say this, but can they represent even more? Can we hear the voices of traditions, institutions, social systems, curricular interests, and protocols that need to be reestablished in a way that honors life? If we as theologians would honor the dialogical relationship between Bart's Mozart and Cone's The Spirituals and the Blues, between the dogmatic categories and the concrete experiences, and hear the light of the gospel, according to Thelonious Monk, then the rhythms we share, even in the academic industrial complex, conceals the same paradoxical significance that many other institutions conceal. Indeed, in the economy of redemption, I am suggesting that we not only hear the gospel in doctrinal statements or the reiteration of creeds, we will hear it in a renewed religious imagination. We will hear it in the songs and the testimony and prayers of those who marched during the Black Freedom Movement. The Spirit's witness was sound in the Black Power movement. as James Cone noted, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the Me Too movement. The symphonic witness was sounding the cries of prisoners and poor in Ferguson, Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza, and Oxford. And it was sounding student encampments when they critique universities, and sounding universities when universities resist unchecked state power. And in all these voices, if we hear the light, we will discern the voice of God, of a God that resounds in every moment and in every place where freedom for humanity and the world resounds. If only we hear the light of the gospel according to Thelonious Monk. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions for our brother?
That was really brilliant, thank you very much. And the bell was ringing at exactly the right time, it was fab.
That took a minute from me right there.
It was so good. I was wondering, when I was listening to you talk, particularly about Monk's way of moving through music, with this tension within tradition and then kind of dancing around the outside, it really made me think of, I think it's Patricia Hill Collins who talks about this idea of being the outsider within, in womanist theology, being outside of traditional community and simultaneously within traditional community, and that offering a really unique perspective. I wonder whether your reading of Monk's kind of musicality sits with that at all, whether it's almost as though he's practicing that idea of being outside and within something at the same time.
And this is why I said a dialogical tension with him, because one of the things people don't know about Monk, when he would get up and dance, he was actually conducting. And so, in fact, at one point they were laughing at Monk when he was doing his little, and he was like, oh, and they realized that he was emphasizing tones in between, right? And so they had to learn to hear with their eyes and see with their ears. And so what I'm saying is that the categories we typically use, we need to critique those categories. That's one of the big lessons I learned from Charles Long. Charles Long was very critical of, his issue was not that he had a problem with theology in the sense that we frame Long. That's not Long's issue. We have Long mixed up there. I know Long quite well on this. Long's issue wasn't whether you did theology or used European sources. His issue was whether European sources overdetermined what you were doing. That's the issue. Right? And Long had a deep understanding. By the way, the only picture on Long's wall, when I removed all of his books, over 200 boxes of books and papers, was Joachim Bach, his Jewish teacher. That was the only picture. And an African mask. Now you got to signify a little bit. You see? So I think we really misread Long when we use him as this person who's an attack. You know, he had a fascination with Karl Barth's theology. You know why? He said, because black people, this is quote, need a big God. Because he sees that's where the heroic energy comes from. From right there. You said hope. Hope theologically is not rooted in the powers. Hope theologically is not rooted in the exactitude of your experience and what you've been through. Hope is something that's like the blues. You know it's all wrong and you can't do nothing about it, but you do something about it. That's Baldwin. I'm quoting Baldwin. His piece is called The Uses of the Blues. You see? And he said, and that's a critique of the American way. Because we ain't trying to do that in America. In fact, I would argue that our problem is we're too busy trying to turn America into the light rather than being the light in the midst of the American darkness. That's the issue for me. I'm not trying to fix America. I'm trying to play some music. Right? And so I have a piece in one of my books, I talk about this idea of going from Minton's Playhouse to God's playground. When you go to Minton's Playhouse, things have been turned around. Now you're sitting at a black man or a black woman's feet. Right? And now the jazz club is like a storefront church. Midnight is like noon. Things turn around, you see? And so there's a sense in which I think we're too preoccupied with the white gaze. See? And I'm not trying to do that because there's too much good stuff. I mean, we got it. And by the way, Long would see Bart as a part of his heritage to exploit. So I'm not trying to follow white interpretations of Barth. I do a left-wing Barth. See, which is a different view of Barth. Even Barth said, hey, you're not trying to make a Barthian out of me, are you? That's what he said, the Barthians. Right? So are we missing something? Or are we just failing to, in some way, take the best out of it? I ain't trying to fix Barth. I don't have time. You want too much. Anyway, so I hope you get that. I get kind of excited about this stuff. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering about this idea that black theology might be more authentic than white theology. What are your views on that?
I think it depends on which theology you read. Right? I mean, there are white theologians who talk about the idea of white folk needing to come to terms with whiteness. And we might see some real authenticity in that. Right? So, but the key is to do the work and to do the reading. Right? Sometimes the critique that we see being leveled is itself the ideology. We get caught in critique. That's why I like books like Kevin Kwashi's book, The Sovereignty of Quiet, where he talks about different ways of responding to power. When do we limit it to just one way of responding? Right? Charles Long understood the importance of being in a boardroom as much as being on the street. You see? So there are these gradations, this wonderful surplus. And what Monk helps us to do is to have some kind of access to the excess, to the possibilities. And I think we have to be careful when our way of responding to issues become ideological and ism. I'm always suspicious. Me and my sister, she left, but we were talking about that yesterday, because someone said, no, it was someone translated the word, they didn't want to translate it as womanism, they wanted to translate it as womanism. Not as womanist, but womanism. And she was like, I don't like that ism. I said, I don't either. That ism is kind of, it reduces a little bit. Anyway. Any other questions?
How would you relate Monk's approach to the tradition of the Hebrew prophets?
Listen, the way I see the Hebrew prophets, wonderful diversity, right? I mean, if you're trying to have a wonderful, joyous day with your church, you're not preaching from the prophets. If you're going to preach to the prophets, you're going to preach from one who might be a priest and a prophet, like a Jeremiah. Somebody that got some good stuff in there, right? There's a saying, you don't invite a prophet to your party. You're trying to have a party, he up there argue with the DJ. Come on, man, you're trying to party. So the Hebrew prophets, just like the New Testament, those 66 books, man, I'm going to quote Bart. I know people say, oh man, you quote Bart, oh my God. But Bart said there's 100 theologies in the Bible. Right? So which prophet are we talking about? Right? I look at the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and James, and all these different positionalities, witnessing to the multidimensionality of God. Right? You can't reduce that to one, just like you can't reduce womanism to one thing. I often say, and I said womanism here, but I often say to my friends who are atheists, who say, yeah, I'm atheist. I said, well, what kind? Right? As if all atheists are the same. You're protest atheists. There are all kinds of reasons why we take our positionality. I just want to play in that space. And so I think Monk does have a lot to do with it. But remember, Monk is playing jazz. What I like about Monk and why I chose Monk was because Monk is not religious in the way we understand religion. I would say the biblical thing is not about being religious, it's about being radically human. But being radically human includes God and the religious things you do properly situated. Our problem is we don't have it properly situated. Right? Anyway, and by the way, I use Long to actually broaden Bart's definition of religion because it's problematic. And I use it to deepen Combs' understanding of Revelation. Most people think you would do it another way. That's the way I do it. Long had a profound understanding of Revelation. He wrote it around in my books, and I'll never forget it. This is because I got the book. But in the description, he said, to Raymond Carr, don't conflate theology and religion. Now, he didn't say you can't have, he didn't say they're mutually exclusive. He just said, don't conflate them. Understand their differences. And then you can do some stuff in the mode of Monk. By the way, Long was one of the first people who said, okay, yeah. And this is where Long has this kind of, he said, Monk is your medium. And I just, oh yeah, that's the right word. Long has this wonderful way of seeing things.
Any other questions? Will you please drop names of the two book references in the chat?
Okay, these book references here, Karl Barth's Little Chart.
Yeah.
James Combs' Spirituals in the Blue. Yeah. And don't forget Raymond Carr's Theology in the Mode of Monk. That's 3 volumes. any other thoughts?
Any other questions? I mean, I've got a question. Okay, so you're citing Monk as your chief interlocutor, but of course Monk is at a particular point in jazz history, kind of mid-20th century. How then would that then speak to, I guess, contemporary people like Wynton Marsalis and...
Wonderful, yeah, I'm probably repeating a little bit, but you know, one of the things that I really do with Monk, look, I did a paper recently at Princeton, and the title of the paper was called Bebop, Barber, and Bark. Because I wanted to, in some way, tease out the revolutionary notions within bebop as something I can use as an analogy to critique, like the Barman Declaration critiqued. See? And it's the same way. When I see this movement right now in America, with over 600 not professors, presidents in their colleges, and they're saying, well, no, we want freedom. I want to in some way play with that, reestablish, redeem that. I know that word's problematic, but I really do. I want the best of that. We don't want to miss that. Even though we need to be critical of the academy. But at the same time, when you see the academy getting together, it's almost like they got their own UN because they see a problem. That might be some good news in that. You see? So I always try to, when I look at Monk, he helps me to think about these differences in that way.
Any final questions?
I have a final question. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking about your language of playing theological music or doing theology with a certain musicality.
Yeah.
And so in light of that, and the jazz tradition, thinking about improvisation as an innovative technology that has a unique particularity within Black cultural forms that has this rich genealogy going back to the ring style.
That's right.
So,
And talk about the ring shot. In fact, Monk, his dance is interpreted by Stuckey as perhaps a movement of a ring shot movement.
So in terms of
Sterling Stuckey, by the way.
so in terms of improvisation, what if you, I don't know if you could, but if you take a step back and look at the way that you're doing theology, like between this nexus of Cohn and Long, what improvisational style are you employing epistemologically? Like what technique are you using?
That I'm employing epistemologically.
Yeah, like when you say that you're using Monk as a medium,
That's right.
what does that mean? How does that function?
Yeah, and I really talk about that in the very opening of the book, right? Where I lay out the idea of, as a theologian, you're coming to this with an analogical imagination. That means that the subject matter of the melody is always a mystery, right? And your approach to it. Now, a philosopher in some ways will be dissatisfied with it. Why? Because they're looking for an epistemology that's grounded in some type of epistemic ground that makes them happy, right? I'm not doing it that way. It's almost phenomenological how I'm approaching it. To understand Monk, you got to sit with the music. You got to listen to what he's doing with the music. And so in some ways, when I approach this, when you think of this idea of my own epistemology, it's not grounded in that typical way. And I spent a whole chapter kind of talking about that and sort of what he's doing. And I'm trying to get at your question, but let me just say this in relationship to your question. There's this notion in African American tradition called capital P play. You hear it in barrel hooks and you see it in other places. I'm under the impression, when you understand redemption, that it liberates you in a way that play then begins to inform work, not work informing play. Right? And some people will even say that, I work hard so I can play hard. I said, no, man. You look at the slaves, you read Jefferson's book on Notes on Virginia. He didn't understand why they were up at night. Their being up at night would get them through the next day. He's trying to figure out when they go to work so they can do his work the next day. And so Black folk have this wonderful capital P tradition of play, and that ludic quality that I'm talking about is rooted in Monk's music. So if we talk primordial, that's one of the things I want to tap into, where my being is not determined by anybody else. Long would say that we have a freedom that the man can't give and the man can't take away. That's my freedom. The freedom is already there. Transformation is at the beginning. It's not an end that I'm looking for. It's how I'm getting to the end that's the transformation. And I think that's a different kind of epistemology. That's just me. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Steve. I think we need to draw this to a close. So thank you, Dr.
Thank you, brother.
McCarthy. I want to thank all our speakers. Dr. Brian Hopkins, Dr. Aaron Rizal, our friend and sister Dr. Andrea White, like she's gone with Professor Luke Beverton, like to have a fancy lunch at Christchurch, so like we don't hold it against her, obviously it's like deserting us for bigger and better things. It's all good. And of course, and last but most definitely not least, Dr. Raymond Carr. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to encourage you, if you are free this evening at 7 o'clock, we have more of the same, but not more of the same. It's a different mode, so it's more aesthetic and artistic. I'd like to invite our brother and friend, Bennett Malonga, if you would stand. Yeah. So Bennett is from South Africa, from Johannesburg, and is a doctoral student at Canterbury Christchurch University. He's a theomusicologist and is a seriously brilliant pianist. And so this evening, obviously no pressure there, but no pressure there. He's a brilliant pianist, and this evening he'll be playing piano and talking about the role of music in the Black liberation struggle in South Africa. And then also be in dialogue with our 4 esteemed speakers, and we'll be looking at how aesthetics and music and liturgy and poetry and preaching have also been ways of carrying Black theology. So please do come. That's at New Road Baptist Church, 7 o'clock. Please do come along, bring your friends. Not many people have signed up, so I mean, they've come a long way. So so it's good to come and to celebrate their great artistry. So that's 7 o'clock this evening at New Road Baptist Church. This evening. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming and making this such a stimulating first in the history of our centre. And thank you again for our brilliant speakers and for fantastic questions and those who joined us remotely. We will hope to have the recording, or that's not to be that up, so our brother at the back who has done the recording, and this will be available shortly. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.